For most people studying the history of Africa, the Berlin Conference of 1884 is remembered as the moment European powers formally divided much of the continent among themselves. Maps were drawn, boundaries were negotiated, territories were claimed, but there is a detail often overlooked. One of the largest empires in the world attended that conference, yet never took colonies in Africa. That empire was Russia. Why would a major imperial power attend a meeting about dividing Africa, participate in the negotiations, and then choose not to claim territory? To answer that question, we must look beyond the conference itself and examine something deeper: geography, strategy, logistics, and the realities of imperial expansion. Because empires do not expand everywhere they can imagine. They expand where conditions allow them to sustain power. And in the late 19th century, those conditions shaped Russia's decisions in ways that are often misunderstood. To understand this story, we must begin with the Berlin Conference itself. By the late 19th century, European interest in Africa had intensified rapidly. Industrialization had increased demand for raw materials. Trade networks were expanding. Rivalries between European powers were growing sharper. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and others all sought influence and territory. But competition created danger. Without agreements, conflicts between European powers could escalate into war. The Berlin Conference was organized in part to prevent that. Convened in 1884 under the leadership of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, representatives from European powers gathered in Berlin to establish rules for claiming territory in Africa. It is important to note something often emphasized in history. No African leaders were invited. Decisions about borders and territories were discussed in European capitals, far from the lands being divided. Russia attended the conference as a recognized European power. It participated in diplomatic discussions and negotiations. But when the scramble for colonies accelerated in the years that followed, Russia did not pursue African territories. To understand why, we must first understand what kind of empire Russia was. Russia was not a maritime empire, it was a land empire. For centuries, Russian expansion had moved across contiguous land rather than across oceans. To the east, Russia expanded across Siberia, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean. To the south, it moved into Central Asia and the Caucasus. To the west, it was deeply involved in European politics and conflicts. This pattern of expansion shaped Russian strategy and capabilities. Empires develop institutions suited to how they expand. Britain developed a powerful navy and global trade networks. France built overseas administrative systems. Russia developed systems suited to controlling vast land territories connected by rivers, roads, and later railways. These differences mattered because colonizing Africa required something Russia did not possess to the same degree as its rivals. And that is sustained global naval power. Overseas empires depended on fleets. Ships transported soldiers, administrators, and supplies. Ships protected trade routes. Ships connected distant colonies to imperial capitals. Without strong naval logistics, maintaining distant colonies became extremely difficult. Britain dominated the seas in the 19th century. France also maintained a significant naval presence. Russia's navy existed, but it was not structured for maintaining a global colonial network across thousands of miles. And distance matters in empire. The further a territory lies from the center of power, the more difficult it becomes to govern, defend, and supply. For Britain, Africa was relatively accessible by sea. For France, parts of North and West Africa were close to Mediterranean ports. For Russia, Africa lay far beyond its primary logistical networks. But geography alone does not explain everything. Russia's priorities also shaped its decisions. In the late 19th century, Russia faced serious strategic concerns much closer to home. It was deeply involved in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. It competed with the Ottoman Empire for influence. It was consolidating control in Central Asia. These regions were geographically closer and strategically more urgent. Empires operate within limits of resources, manpower, and attention. Every campaign, every frontier, every administrative system requires investment. Expanding into Africa would have required diverting resources away from regions Russia already considered vital to its security. And security concerns often outweigh opportunities for expansion. Another factor was infrastructure. By the late 19th century, Russia was investing heavily in railways, including what would become the Trans-Siberian Railway. Rail infrastructure reinforced Russia's land-based model of expansion. It connected territories across Eurasia, strengthened internal control, and supported economic integration. This further reduced the strategic incentive to pursue distant overseas colonies. There is another dimension to this story that is often overlooked. Colonies were not always profitable. Maintaining colonies required administrators, military garrisons, transportation networks, and communication systems. Some colonies generated wealth, but many required substantial investment before becoming economically productive. For some empires, colonial expansion was driven as much by prestige and rivalry as by immediate economic gain. Russia, facing internal challenges and continental commitments, may have judged that the costs of African colonies outweighed the benefits. Diplomacy also played a role. The Berlin Conference was not only about acquiring territory, it was also about maintaining influence within the European balance of power. By attending, Russia ensured that its voice was heard in negotiations affecting global politics, even if it did not pursue African colonies itself. Participation did not always imply territorial ambition. Sometimes it reflected diplomatic necessity. To understand Russia's position, it helps to compare it with other empires. Britain was a maritime empire whose strength depended on naval supremacy and global trade. France sought prestige and influence through overseas territories. Belgium, under King Leopold II, pursued colonial expansion in the Congo for economic and political reasons. Each empire acted according to its capabilities and priorities. Russia acted according to its own. And this reveals something important about history. Empires are not driven by ambition alone. They are constrained by geography, logistics, economics, and internal politics. These forces shape decisions in ways that are often invisible in simplified narratives. The absence of Russian colonies in Africa was not an accident. It was the result of structural realities. Russia expanded where expansion was feasible, across land, along borders, through territories that could be supplied and defended using existing systems. Africa did not fit that pattern. And yet, Russia's presence at the Berlin Conference remains significant. It reminds us that imperial competition was not limited to those who ultimately acquired colonies. It involved diplomacy, negotiation, and the broader politics of power in Europe. The conference itself also reveals something larger about the nature of imperialism in the 19th century. Africa was not divided because it was empty or unimportant. It was divided because it was valuable. Resources, trade routes, labor, and strategic position all made African territories desirable to expanding industrial powers. Understanding why Russia did not colonize Africa helps us understand why others did. Because the same forces that limited Russia's expansion enabled others to pursue it. Naval power, geographic access, industrial capacity, strategic priorities. These factors determined which empires expanded overseas and which expanded across land. And those patterns shaped the modern world. Borders drawn in the late 19th century still influence politics today. Trade routes established during colonial periods still affect economies. And the legacy of imperial competition continues to shape international relations. The story of Russia at the Berlin Conference is not only about what happened. It is about what did not happen and why. And sometimes, what did not happen reveals as much about history as what did. Because history is not only a record of actions, it is also a record of constraints. Empires rise within limits. They expand within limits, and those limits are often set long before decisions are made. Geography sets them, logistics enforces them, economics defines them, and strategy follows. Russia attended the Berlin Conference, but Africa was never where its empire was meant to grow. And understanding that helps us see history more clearly, not as a series of isolated events, but as patterns shaped by forces larger than any single decision. If you want to understand Africa beyond the headlines, subscribe to Africa Explained.